This is the last known footage of Margaret Ellis, a 74-year-old widow from Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. The date was June 15, 1999. She had parked her silver sedan inside the downtown resort's parking garage after running errands. The camera shows her leaning over the open hood of her car, inspecting the engine. At first glance, it looks ordinary. But then, just off to the side, you notice a man. He stands completely still, half hidden by a concrete pillar, silently watching her. Moments later, both of them vanish from the camera's view. That was the last time anyone saw Margaret alive. Three months later, a fisherman on Lake Coeur d'Alene called police after his line snagged on something heavy beneath the water. When police divers went down, they uncovered a silver Buick Century. It was Margaret's car. At first, investigators considered it a tragic accident. An elderly woman losing control and plunging into the water, but the details told a different story. The driver's side window was rolled all the way down. The seatbelts were cut, and in the passenger seat, tangled and soaked, lay a length of rope. There was blood, little amounts, but undeniable on the headrest. But there was no body in the car, no body in the lake. Margaret hadn't simply disappeared. Someone had made her vanish. The morning after the silver Buick was hauled in from the lake, it sat dripping under the sterile lights of the county's forensic garage. The first order of business for investigators was simple: identify the owner. A check on the license plate came back immediately. The car was registered to a Margaret Ellis. The name was instantly flagged, matching an open missing persons report filed 3 months prior. Margaret Ellis was 74 years old. A widow for nearly a decade, she was a quiet but cherished fixture in the Coeur d'Alene community. Neighbors described her as gentle and unassuming, the last person anyone would imagine as the victim of a violent crime. She lived a simple, peaceful life, which made the evidence found in her car all the more disturbing. The original missing persons report from June 15th was straightforward. Margaret had gone out to run errands and never came home. With no leads, the case had quickly gone cold. But now, with her car recovered, the investigation was transformed. This was no longer a missing person. It was a homicide. Detectives now knew Margaret hadn't just disappeared. She was taken. And the only clue they had to the person responsible was a grainy, silent piece of footage from the day she vanished, showing a nameless man watching her from the shadows. With Margaret Ellis identified, the full weight of the investigation now rested on the shoulders of the nameless man in the security footage. The grainy tape was the only lead they had, and detectives analyzed every second, searching for a clue. The original VHS was sent to the FBI's forensic lab in Quantico, where imaging specialists worked for weeks to enhance the quality. Still, the man's face remained stubbornly obscured by shadow and poor resolution. Despite the lack of a clear facial image, the analysis did yield critical details. From the man's posture and the way he moved, experts estimated his height to be just under 6 feet, with a lean but strong build. His movements were calm, patient, and deliberate, not the frantic energy of an amateur. His clothing was generic, offering no logos or distinct features that could help identify him. He was a ghost on the tape. Using this information, criminal profilers began to construct a sketch of the suspect's personality. The targeting of a vulnerable, elderly woman, combined with the careful staging of the car to suggest an accident, pointed to a predator who was methodical and organized. They believed this was not an impulsive act of violence, but a planned event by someone who enjoyed the sense of power and control. They theorized that the man likely had a history of similar, perhaps less violent offenses. The problem was, with no name and no face, this profile was just a theory, and after months of work, the investigation had hit a solid wall. A bulletin containing the suspect's physical description, his methodical approach, and the stills from the CCTV footage was sent to law enforcement agencies across the Pacific Northwest. For weeks, the request yielded nothing. Then, they got a hit. A detective in a neighboring county recognized the method. His department had 2 unsolved assault cases from the previous year with a strikingly similar approach. Digging deeper, the combined task force uncovered a third incident, another woman who had disappeared under nearly identical circumstances. The pattern was unmistakable and chilling. In each case, an elderly woman, alone in a parking garage, was approached by a man offering help. In the earlier incidents, the encounters ended in assault and robbery. with the attacker stealing small sentimental items, a brooch, a wedding band, a wallet, but the crimes had been escalating. The predator had progressed from simple theft to abduction, and, with Margaret, to murder. The man in the footage was not a one-time killer. He was a serial predator who had been practicing his craft, escalating his violence, and leaving a trail of terror that had, until now, gone unnoticed. For months after discovering the pattern, a tense quiet fell over the region. Investigators knew the predator was out there, but he had gone to ground. They had a profile and a method, but no face and no name. They could only wait for him to make a mistake. The mistake came on a Tuesday afternoon in a hospital parking garage 50 miles away. An elderly woman was struggling to load a walker into her car when a polite man approached, offering help. He was calm and reassuring, but as he maneuvered to corner her against the open car door, another vehicle pulled into the space opposite them. Startled and exposed, the predator immediately abandoned his attempt. He muttered an excuse and walked briskly away, climbing into a weathered utility van and speeding out of the garage. But it was too late. The witness had already focused, memorizing the first few characters of the license plate. When police arrived, both the witness and the security guard were able to provide a clear, detailed description of the man's face. After nearly a year of chasing a ghost, investigators finally had what they needed. They had a partial plate, a vehicle description, and a composite sketch that was immediately sent to every officer in the state. The net was closing. For the first time, their nameless target had a face. The partial license plate was the key. Running the characters through the DMV database generated a list of over 200 possible vehicles. When investigators cross-referenced that list with individuals who had prior records for assault, the search narrowed to a single name: Thomas Halpern, a 42-year-old drifter with a history of petty violence. Armed with a search warrant, a team descended on Halpern's small, nondescript apartment. At first, it seemed unremarkable. But tucked away in a dusty box in his closet, they found it. A collection of small personal items that did not belong to him. There was a silver locket, a single earring, and a worn leather wallet. And deep inside the box, nestled in a cloth, was a small antique brooch shaped like a hummingbird. A detective on the scene immediately recognized it from the case file. It belonged to Margaret Ellis. The case against him solidified when the forensics team finished searching his van. They found fibers in the carpet that were a perfect match to trace evidence recovered from Margaret's submerged car. The trophies provided the motive, but the fibers provided the undeniable physical link. The ghost from the parking garage finally had a name and a face. Thomas Halpern was arrested that evening, and as the news broke, the community breathed a collective sigh of relief, unaware that the most haunting question, "Where is Margaret?" was still unanswered. With Thomas Halpern in custody, investigators began to assemble the fractured pieces of his life, trying to understand the man who had haunted the region from the shadows. What they uncovered was not a dramatic supervillain, but something far more disturbing. A quiet, unremarkable man whose private pathologies had festered into a meticulous ritual of violence. Halpern's motive was a tangled knot of resentment that began in his childhood. When he was 8 years old, his mother left the family, an act of abandonment that he internalized as a profound betrayal. Over the years, this childhood wound twisted his perception of women, particularly older, vulnerable figures who reminded him of the mother he had lost. He saw them not as people, but as symbols of the one who had left him. His crimes were not driven by money or lust, but by a chilling psychological need for power through erasure. He derived a deep satisfaction from transforming a person's life into an absence, turning an individual into a cold case file, a local news story, and a lingering question. By staging Margaret's car to look like an accident, he was attempting to control the narrative, erasing his own culpability and turning his violent act into a simple tragedy. This fed into his second compulsion, collecting trophies. The small sentimental items he stole were not for monetary value. They were tokens of his control, physical proof that he had possessed the power to make a person vanish. Each object, Margaret's brooch, another victim's locket, was a secret reminder of his success. His criminal history showed a clear escalation. He began with petty assaults and robberies, testing his methods. With each successful crime, his fantasies hardened, and his actions grew bolder, culminating in the abduction and murder of Margaret Ellis. He didn't confess all at once. The story came in pieces, pulled from him by detectives over hours of questioning. It was a narrative stripped of emotion, told with a chilling detachment as if he were recounting a task he had simply completed. He said he saw Margaret in the garage and thought she looked helpless. He watched her for several minutes from behind the pillar, waiting. When he approached, he used a soft voice, offering to look at the engine. It was his standard method, a disarming kindness that lowered their guard. He said that once she was distracted, looking away from him, he simply took control. He described a short, intense struggle, which he dismissed as a brief panic, before he restrained her with a rope he kept in his van for work. He forced her into the passenger seat of her own car and drove out of the garage. He was calm, unhurried. He drove them to a remote, unlit access road near the lake, a place he knew from his wanderings. There, under the cover of darkness, he staged the scene. He admitted to cutting the seatbelts and rolling down the driver's side window to make it look like she had tried to escape after an accident. Before pushing the car into the water, he took the hummingbird brooch from her coat. He called it a little thing, just something to remember. He recounted these details with a flat, resentful tone, but when the detectives asked the one question that mattered, "What did you do with her, Tommy? Where is Margaret?" a wall went up. His narrative stopped. He would only say, "She's gone." He refused to elaborate, offering nothing more. He had given them the timeline of the crime, but he was keeping the final, most important secret for himself. It was his last act of control. The jury saw the chilling footage from the garage. They heard the eyewitness testimony from his failed attempt, and they were shown the photograph of Margaret's hummingbird brooch found in a box in the killer's closet. He was found guilty of kidnapping and murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But for the family of Margaret Ellis, the verdict was not an ending. During his confession, Halpern was manipulative and vague, refusing to give up the one piece of information they so desperately needed: the location of her body. Despite the conviction, extensive searches of the lake and surrounding wilderness turned up nothing. Thomas Halpern was behind bars, but in the end, he had achieved his twisted goal. He had transformed Margaret Ellis from a beloved mother and grandmother into a permanent, haunting void. The case was officially closed, but justice never brought closure, and the question of where she was would linger forever.